The following presentation by Monument Capital Management, LLC, is intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the presentation serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice from Monument or any other investment professional of your choosing. Please see additional information disclosure at the end of this presentation. A copy of Monument's current written disclosure brochure discussing our advisory services and fees is available upon request or at www.monumentwealthmanagement.com.
All right, we're changing things up on Off the Wall for our 60th episode. I'm Emily Harper, and I'm a partner and wealth advisor at Monument. I'm taking the reins today as host with my co-host, Goodwin, also a wealth advisor and certified financial planner on the Monument team. Heaven, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Emily. Excited to be here.
We're excited to record with you today. I'd also like to welcome today's guest, Mike Conrath, who is a managing director and chief retirement strategist for JP Morgan Asset Management. He heads up a few different teams at JP Morgan and is responsible for researching and delivering timely retirement-related insights to clients and financial professionals to improve retirement outcomes for individuals across the wealth spectrum. He's been in the financial industry for over 25 years and has also had roles focused on education savings, including head of education savings for JP Morgan Asset Management.
Mike also has an interesting fun fact. He's a semi-professional musician and plays with several bands as both a lead guitar player and singer. Mike, welcome to Off the Wall, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Evan, and thank you, Emily. Excited to be here.
Yeah, our listeners are really lucky. Mike is just such an expert in this area, and we're excited for all of the insights that he'll share today. But today's topic is retirement and the common challenges we see facing high net worth individuals today as they plan for it. We'll focus on three challenges we see often, both financial and non-financial.
But before we dive into talking about the challenges that high net worth individuals are facing as they plan for retirement today, could you just quickly talk us through the idea of the retirement equation and the idea of control?
Sure. So the retirement equation, I would say the best thing about it is that there is zero math involved with it. And, I say that half jokingly, but, as financial professionals, we tend to focus a lot on the numbers, especially as it relates to retirement. And make no mistake about it, the numbers are certainly important, but when we're talking about the retirement equation, it's designed to put things in perspective outside of the numbers. And what I mean by that is think of basically three levels of control. So there's three components to that equation. Things that you have no control over, things that you have somewhat limited control over, and then things you have total and complete control over. So just to take a quick minute to talk through those. What do we have no control over? Well, we can't control the financial markets. We can't control geopolitics. We can't control elections, unfortunate events such as war. So basically all the things that are primarily like right in front of us on our news feeds or right in front of our faces when we turn on the TV and the media, ironically, we have no control over these things. So it's important to keep that in perspective because I could tell you just for me personally, sometimes when I see some bad news, that sets off my emotional hot button. So it's important to just again, have that framework. So what do we have some control over? Well, we can control to some extent our longevity. And no, I'm not here to tell you that I have the secrets to living past 100. Certainly.
Darn.
Yeah, there's
Who
no.
would want to?
Yeah. So, but we can influence that somewhat with, our decision that we make around diet, exercise, health, wellness, both physical and mental. So we can influence longevity to some extent. Also, we have some limited control over how long we work. Okay, sometimes we make that decision, other times that decision is made for us due to a number of circumstances. So let's just pivot to what do we have full and complete control of? Quite simply, it comes down to two things. One, our savings, and two, our spending. And by savings, I'm not just talking about a savings account. I'm talking about investing. How we choose to invest, what we choose to invest in, and importantly, how that connects to our goals. And part of that, as it relates to our goals in the retirement context, is how we spend, how much we spend, but also what we choose to spend on and what that looks like. So yeah, just important to frame in terms of the levels of control of the equation outside of just the numbers itself.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mike. We're big proponents of focusing on the things that you can control. There's no doubt a ton of information on our news feeds every day on social media that's completely anxiety inducing. But if we can get people to really focus on what's in their control and, make the most of the things that are in control, but also be aware of those things, but not let the things they can't control completely, guide their decision making. So, thank you for laying that all out. I would actually like to start with something that you didn't explicitly talk about in terms of being in your control, but one challenge I see a lot when I'm working with high net worth people, whether they're prospective clients and we're having our first conversation, or clients we've had decades long relationships with, really fleshed out the answer to the question, what's the money for them? But one challenge I really see is not emotionally preparing for just the reality of retirement and envisioning what retirement actually means for them. When you're thinking about people who have started businesses or work in really high powered fields, they find a lot of purpose and identity in what they do. And when they're no longer working, that can be a really big emotional shock. I was just reading the Harvard Business Review yesterday, and I found a recent study that found the prevalence of depression among retirees to be 28%, along with a decline in mental health over an average post-retirement period of 6 years, which, when you think about retirement, a lot of people are excited for the things that retirement can mean, but there's also that aspect of it represents a really different phase in life. So, Mike, maybe you could speak to some of the emotional aspects of retirement and what people can do as they plan to have better well-being in retirement.
Yeah, that's actually a great topic, and I think it's one that's probably not talked about enough as it relates to retirement, Emily. And I think importantly, it's just kind of taking a step back and realizing, well, what does retirement mean? And it sounds like that's a question you ask of your clients and prospective clients, which is super important. I think it's recognizing that retirement does mean different things to different people, and for some people, retirement could mean having, sustainable income, making sure that their needs are fully covered, as well as what's on their bucket list, their wants. For other people, it's spending time with friends, family, could be their community, charity, or any combination of these things. Again, it's in the eye of the beholder. So I think retirement is not this generic thing. It's highly individualized. And importantly, I think there's a few mindsets around it. One is there are some folks that say, I just want to completely unplug when I enter retirement. And I could think of a former colleague of mine here at JP Morgan who retired a few years ago. And on his last day, it was a Friday afternoon. And in fairness, he left after the big lunch we had for him. But we saw the empty office and there was a single business card on his keyboard computer, and he left it there without saying anything. And when you looked at it, it said something to the effect of, instead of his name, it said retired, and underneath the title, it said don't bother. And then where his contact information would be, it said, don't call, don't email. And it said hours that I'm off. It said Sunday through Monday, 24/7. So you get the idea. That was his idea. Just, I'm going to unplug completely. Mm-hmm. But retirement's actually not a binary decision for a lot of families. And what we found in research we've done looking at Chase households is that 53% of households between the ages of 60 and 69 who retire, they're actually just partially retired. That means one member of a couple could be working fully or partially, or an individual can be just working part-time. And that's an important thing, because it gets back to what you were getting at, Emily, is that I think there's this big disconnect out there. And what I mean by that is there's this big disconnect, because think about it, we spent decades planning and working to reach that retirement point, but we sometimes spend very little time planning for how we're actually going to spend the rest of our time, the next chapter, which could be easily 35 plus years in retirement. So there's this disconnect there. And it's important to know what you're retiring to rather than just what you're retiring from, like my former colleague here. Yeah. And we have an acronym that we use here at JP Morgan.
We love acronyms.
Yeah, okay. So we call this PUSH, P-U-S-H. And what PUSH represents is the P is purpose. So creating some reason to get up in the morning, like having a defined goal. And that could be a simple thing. It could be, hey, I'm going to have my coffee, then I'm going to do walking exercise for the next hour after that. And then from this time, I'm going to do this. It's just having some type of schedule or purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. And that relates to the second thing, the U in PUSH, use. So how are you going to use your time? Now that you have time, and while we're working, we think, oh, if I only had more time, I'd do these things. You have that time, but you might want to be structured around how you use it. But it's important to engage with friends, family, and that's actually leading to the S, the socialization. And there's a lot of studies on this, but people who tend to socialize more often than not have a general better sense of mental and physical wellness, better outlook on things. They're able to enjoy themselves that much more. And that ultimately leads to the H, that the health, because your health is basically what is going to make or break your retirement. And unfortunately, I know of people personally who experience healthcare issues early on in retirement, and that changed the game entirely. Mm-hmm. They weren't prepared for that. So it's talking through these things. What does that look like? And I can tell you that someone very close to me, on a positive note, is partially retired and happily. This is someone in my extended family who, it happens to be my mother, but she decided that she was going to get a job working 4 hours a week at the local school. She loves kids, and if she can't be with her grandkids all the time, she wants to be around other kids, bring her positive energy. And long story short is, she works 4 days a week in a school, and she works with some friends as well. So it has all these elements of the PUSH. It has the purpose. She's using her time to do something that she enjoys. She has the socialization, and ultimately, it's keeping her active and healthy.
That's fantastic. That's a great story. And I think, that's something we commonly see too, is philanthropy is something that is important to a lot of our clients, and the way they start to think about that and that purpose shifts a little bit when they actually have the time to dedicate to organizations. We see a lot of people, start to prioritize giving their time and their energy to these organizations that they care about. And, there may still be some financial commitment there, but it becomes a lot more purposeful for them. So I love hearing how people choose to spend their time when they're quote unquote retired. And I love that framework that you shared, Mike. I'm a big fan of, frameworks and, tools that help us kind of wrap our head around some of these intangible ideas and concepts. We have an assessment that we like to use with clients to just kind of uncover their perspective on retirement and retirement-related wellness or satisfaction. Some people see retirement as an opportunity to keep working, but in a reduced capacity, explore new hobbies, adventures, or relax like your former colleague without a set schedule every day. And I think the really important thing there is you have to understand that to then know what direction to move in with your wealth planning. If there are things that you're going to be funding in retirement that you maybe didn't spend your time doing, you have to know that in advance and have these things really come together and plan for these things. So love all these tools and tips. Let's turn to some of the challenges that come from things that are outside of our control, because they are the things that tend to give us a lot of anxiety. Your background in tax, Mike, and I'm a big fan of tax planning and just the importance of tax planning over a lifetime, not just year to year, but taxes and the tax landscape over your lifetime will, have a major impact on the amount of your wealth that's actually available to you to fund your goals like retirement or creating a lasting legacy for your family. We know taxes are a certainty, but we also know that change is inevitable. So, Mike, what are some of the challenges you see when it comes to planning for a changing tax landscape, and how can high net worth investors navigate this?
Yeah, so I think it's an important topic for sure, because it's not just what you're earning on your investments, what you actually get to keep, because what you get to keep is what you actually get to spend. I know that's pretty simplistic, but it's an important concept, and you certainly want to be thinking about that. And this also goes back to like the equation. Like, we cannot control the tax landscape. Things are going to happen, or they're not, or they're going to evolve, but we can control how we plan for different what if scenarios. So I think that's super important. One thing that is coming to a head after 2025 is the current tax rates that are in effect right now are scheduled to sunset. So there's something called TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which effectively lowered the marginal tax rates pretty much across the board. And there were some other provisions there around estate and gift taxes as well. So a lot in there, but the current tax rules that are in effect right now, again, are scheduled to sunset or change or revert to the way they were prior to this after 2025. So it's important to be thinking about these things now, and just like thinking of it just from an individual tax rate perspective. I mean, for many clients, they could be looking at a 3 to 9 point increase in their marginal tax rate, assuming their income just stays exactly the same. So that's a big deal. I mean, to put some specific numbers around it, let's say someone makes $300,000 today, that they are looking at a 9 point increase in their federal marginal tax rate. So that is real money. That certainly can impact your spending or your future spending. So you have to keep that in perspective. I mean, the good news is there's a number of things you can do from an investment perspective, but even just from a planning perspective. They look considering like Roth conversions, thinking where your tax rate is now versus where it might be in the future. And the thing about Roth conversions, one of the downsides, pushbacks that clients typically have is there's a potential tax sting in doing that. So you've got to look at it holistically, but it's not an all or nothing scenario. You could do partial conversion. So I'm not sure how much you want to get into some of those nuances, but you do have options around the stuff that you can control.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that the increase in taxes is not only going to impact your retirement savings today in terms of maybe you have less dollars to allocate to retirement savings because your taxes are going up and that's taking more of the income. But then also in the future, there are uncertain tax rates, uncertain, tax policy that you're going to be subject to in the future, and focusing on the things that are within your control are great actions to take. We talk about Roth conversions a lot. Mike, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, but do you feel like there's a sweet spot in terms of current marginal rates and where marginal rates will be post 2025 for thinking about, where a Roth conversion might make sense?
Yeah, there could be. And, one of the, rules of thumb is that many people think about it is, okay, I might be in a lower tax rate in the future, so maybe it doesn't make sense to do full or partial conversion. And that may be well and true, but it might not be true as well. I mean, another thing to think about, Emily, is for many individuals with the passage of the Secure Act, or version 2.0 of the Secure Act, RMDs, required minimum distributions. So basically, the IRS is forcing you to take distributions out of your qualified retirement plans. And big reason they do that is they want to start collecting taxes on those dollars. But the age has been pushed out for many individuals from 73 to age 75. So for those individuals that don't necessarily need to take those dollars, they can push out their RMDs further. And maybe that's one way to think about, okay, I could maybe do a partial conversion now, because the other pushback you would get is, well, I'm taking RMDs, so I'm getting taxed on that. And then I'm going to do a conversion, so I'm getting taxed over here. So there might be a sweet spot to think about pushing out your RMDs for as far as you can and prior to taking those RMDs, doing some type of Roth conversion. But again, a lot of this depends on individual circumstances, and there is a bit of math for sure involved with this, but you do have optionality here.
That's a great point. And Mike, thinking about the RMD age getting pushed out to 75, that definitely gives people more runway to do those conversions and realize that taxable income over a longer period of time. Could you maybe speak to the implications of taxable income amounts on things in retirement, like Social Security benefits or the cost of Medicare?
Yeah, sure. And that's actually a great segue, because I was hoping we'd get to that. So first of all, Social Security, I think for most of your clients, they will be taxed on that, meaning there's an income threshold, which is relatively low, at which up to 85% of your Social Security income is taxed. So we're looking at relatively low income rates there, so I'm going to make an assumption, which is always tricky, but that your clients will be looking at some level of taxation on the Social Security. So I don't think that's as important as the Medicare piece is. And first of all, just points on Medicare quickly is that for those who have not yet retired, newsflash, Medicare is not free. So yes, you've been paying into this system for years, if not decades. You see that come out of your payroll taxes, your paycheck, or your business is building that into your payroll system for your employees. So it's not free. And right now, just using some back of the napkin averages for someone who's 65 years old, they could be looking at roughly $550 a month in Medicare premiums. Again, that's using some assumptions there, but where they're projected to go is somewhat alarming. So in 30 years, that $550 could be closer to $1,500. Now, I'm sure some folks are saying, well, okay, what about inflation? That's actually netting out inflation. So that's in today's dollars. So you're looking at, for many folks, a 3x increase in Medicare premiums as they get older. And by the way, that's not my view. That's not JP Morgan's view. That is right out of the Medicare trustees report. So this is actually the government telling us that you should expect to pay and pay more in the future. And if you think about it, your healthcare needs will naturally go up as you age as well, and your premiums will go up along with that. So, the things that you have bucketed as needs, that certainly needs to be part of that and need to factor in inflation. You're basically looking at a 6% inflation rate on Medicare costs. So, which is well and above, other expenses that you might put an inflator around. The other thing specific to your question, Emily, is around taxes. And there's something called Medicare surcharges. So depending on your income, that $550 average rough amount that I threw out a minute ago, you may actually be paying more on that depending on your income. So for example, if someone is an individual and they're making $500,000 or more in modified adjusted gross income, they're looking at a $500, $500 surcharge. So basically almost
that's monthly, right?
Yes, that's 500. Thank you. That's per month. So that is a pretty big number. So an additional $6,000 a year, if you will, for anyone 500K or over if you're single. So you need to think about that holistically as it relates to your overall situation, where you're pulling income from in your portfolio, how that income's being taxed or not. So this all ties together. The healthcare, the taxes, the income, it's all related. So it's great that you all think about this holistically like that.
Yeah, you're making a great case for planning right now.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say, having something that we really try to stress is just having diversified sources of retirement funding, different asset types that are, taxed in different ways, whether that's, Roth money that's hopefully withdrawn tax-free if, for qualified reasons, or, assets that are generating capital gains, which may be taxed at a lower rate, One thing I see on social media all the time, Mike, and Heaven, I'm sure you do too, this concept of the quote unquote mega backdoor Roth. And it's sold as like, well, this is a no brainer. Everyone should be, you know, putting away as much money as they possibly can in a Roth 401k. And I think there's a lot of practical limitations when it comes to whether or not that's a viable strategy for some people. But Mike, could you maybe just explain the mega backdoor Roth concept and some of the considerations around that?
Yeah, and I think you're right in that it may not be applicable to everyone, or not everyone may be able to leverage this concept too. So, I mean, just to level set, the idea of doing a backdoor Roth is for individuals who otherwise cannot invest in a Roth due to the income limits. So don't quote me, I believe for 2024 as a couple, if you make, once you hit $240,000 in income, you're excluded from contributing to a Roth. So many clients won't necessarily be eligible for that. So that means that the lion's share of their quote unquote retirement labeled assets could be in your traditional IRAs, 401ks, which might be fully taxable when they take money out. So the idea of the backdoor Roth is to contribute into a traditional retirement account and then do almost an immediate conversion. Since there's no earnings or presumably very little, you'll be able to convert it because there's no income limits on doing a Roth conversion. Where the mega concept or the mega backdoor comes into play is it relates to your workplace retirement plan. So for example, if I'm putting money into a 401k and under 50 years old, you're looking at $23,000 contribution limit for the year, but your plan may allow you to do after-tax contributions as well. So you can actually fund an additional $46,000. And if my back the napkin math is okay, that gets you to roughly $69,000. You get another $7,500 if you're 50 or above. Okay, so enough of the numbers. The idea here is that you can put a decent amount into your traditional 401k, for example, and the idea is to convert that money either in plan to the Roth or out of plan to an IRA. And there's a few considerations. One is, first of all, do you have the spare cash on hand to fully fund this account? The other things, which are just as important, which could be a make or break scenario, is does the plan actually allow for after-tax contributions? So think of the after-tax as, back to the numbers, as the amount over and above your $23,000, which is your general contribution limit for most individuals. So does the plan actually allow for after-tax contributions, the additional $46,000, for example, on top of that? And the other thing is, does the plan allow for in-service distribution? So in other words, while I'm still working, can I actually convert in plan, or can I roll it out of plan to my own IRA account? So I think roughly less than half of plans will actually even allow for that. So you definitely want to check the plan documents, and that's obviously where your team can come into play to kind of dig into that. So it could be an opportunity to transition assets from being tax deferred to tax free. Again, thinking about future tax rates and trying to keep as much as you've earned over the years. But there are a number of factors that will basically determine whether you can even do it or not.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that, Mike. I will say in practice, I mean, as much as everybody wants to accumulate as much, in Roth as they can, I've seen very, very few opportunities in reality and practice for the mega backdoor Roth just because of how plans are designed. So to your point, it's going to differ for every plan. It's something we can absolutely look at, but a lot of times it's not going to be this, magical thing that you saw on an Instagram reel that tells you how, to maximize as much Roth money as you can. So awesome. Thank you so much for that conversation around taxes. I could go on for hours about taxes and tax planning, but I won't subject our listeners to that.
Not today, anyways. But let's talk about one more challenge in the realm of things that aren't fully in your control, and that's longevity. So with the likelihood that, with longevity is going to come some need for assistance at some point in time. JP Morgan's Guide to Retirement shows that if you're 65 today, there's a 90% probability that at least one person in a couple will live to 85, and a 73% chance that one will live to 90. And then there's also the stat that, 48% of people age 90 plus need assistance with 2 or more activities of daily living or have severe cognitive impairment. So, changes in abilities like this may require spending on long-term care services, a move possibly to be closer to children, home modifications, or, even different housing arrangements entirely. So, Mike, can you speak to the current landscape of long-term care and the options out there for funding this potential big liability?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack there, Evan. So let me, actually, if I can put each of you on the spot, and you have no idea where I'm going with this, but we're going to have fun. So do either of you know anyone who has reached the age of 100?
No, I do not.
I don't think I do.
Oh, okay. See, I know 2 people. One of them is my friend's grandmother, and she's 102. Sharp as a tack, by the way, and doing incredibly well. But I just bring this up because most people, when I ask them, can think it may not be someone super close to them, but they know someone we've all read stories and whatnot. And right now, there are 90,000 centenarians in the U.S.
Wow.
90,000. So that centenarian being reach age 100.
That's a shocking number.
Well, check this out. Just a few years ago, or 2010 specifically, there were 53,000. So we've nearly doubled that amount.
Wow.
In, less than a few years. So if you look ahead to 2060, that number, 90,000 today again, is set to climb to 600,000. So maybe that's my kids. I don't know. But so the good news is we're living longer, but long way of getting to your question, Heaven, is the longer we live, the more likely we will need some type of pretty serious healthcare, professional healthcare, including long-term care. And this is something that if you don't plan for it or have the discussion, it could come as a shock and a surprise. And it could be a shock from a financial perspective, but it could also be an emotional shock as well. And I'd say both of those have pretty high weightings overall in terms of level of importance. And when we look at, in the research we do around actual households, when we look at their spending, we see spending typically at its highest in the early years of retirement, which makes sense. People are more active, they might be traveling, again, doing things on their bucket list. Then it starts to taper off. But then there's an inflection point as they age, it goes back up again. And that's where we see healthcare and long-term care issues eating up a larger proportion of that household spending budget and their overall net worth. And just to share some findings, and we talk about this in our guide to retirement, is that first of all, women are more likely to require long-term care. So sorry, Emily, sorry, Evan. But the reason is you actually live longer. Women live longer than men generally. So that's the why. So women generally are more likely to require it because they do live longer, and they will need it for longer if they do in fact need long-term care. And just to throw a couple stats at you, if you look at individuals who need long-term care for 5 years or more, it's 36% of men and 41% of women. So pretty high stats around that. And as you age, obviously your probabilities get to those higher points, but the real zinger is the cost around this. So for women, the average lifetime cost is close to about $280,000. And for men, it's about $200,000. Again, men maybe shorter duration of care, less likelihood because we don't live as long, but those are averages. If you look at an individual level, and I'm sure many of you can think of different clients you've worked with, there's a very wide range of costs. So the averages could be somewhat misleading and could, in some ways, underestimate what potential costs are. I'm not here for fear factor, by the way. I'm an optimist. But so let's talk about potential solutions. And you have a few approaches here. One approach is to look at a traditional long-term care policy. And, this is designed to cover those costs so that you don't have that shock to your budget, to your net worth. You do have to qualify for those. So it's, for anyone who's applied for life insurance, you're going through a questionnaire, you're going through underwriting, you have to qualify along those lines. There are also some hybrid approaches which incorporate life insurance. It could have a long-term care rider. That may require a different level or higher level of premium upfront potentially. But again, there's underwriting involved with these things. The other way is to self-insure or to self-fund it. So saying that, I've been accumulating my savings, I have an investment account, I've got money bucketed for this what-if scenario. I'm going to leverage that and not go the insurance route. And that could work. It might also not work. Just some things to consider as it relates to self-funding long-term care is you might be, I'm saying the general you here, okay, not you guys, but we found that some people may be actually reluctant to spend for the needed care if they don't have the insurance, because now they're at that point. It's like, gosh, I've got to spend how much every year? I'm spending 6 figures every year on nursing home. Not that they don't want to, but what happens is sometimes that burden falls on a family member. They say, instead of paying, I'll just take care of mom, for example. So you need to think about that. And are you prepared to do that, put that burden on yourself or your loved ones? And that's a highly personalized decision, the conversation. But there's also like a tail risk factor here that if you need care for a very long period of time, that will naturally eat up more of your portfolio. So if you're thinking about your legacy, passing on wealth to your children, grandchildren, charity, so that's a consideration. These long-term care costs can chip away in a pretty meaningful way at your legacy or your philanthropic goals along those lines. The other thing, and I'm just throwing out some what-if scenarios here or considerations that I've seen, is that if you're self-funding, funds might be sufficient for the first spouse, but you have to consider what's left for the survivor and also who is left to care for that surviving spouse as well. Will it fall on the children, others, what have you? So, there's a combination of family dynamics and finances here. So I think all in, it comes down to, again, personal decisions and how you choose, assuming you have the means to pay, either self-fund or go the insurance route. But it's thinking about the potential burden on friends and loved ones. Importantly, I think having the conversation with your family, so with your children, with your spouse, loved ones, and making sure that your family understands your specific wishes. Like, this is what I want. And I can tell you, we went through this with my own father fairly recently, and he wanted to avoid leaving the house. He wanted to stay home, and that created some challenges in and of itself. But some people have certain wishes, so it's important to articulate what those are, as early as possible. And this way, you have more control and you have time to plan for these things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We're probably about to say the exact same thing, Emily, is those emotional aspects of planning for, where you're going to be spending most of your time or how you're going to be getting the help that you need in those later years of life is something that it's an uncomfortable topic to talk about. Families, kind of shy away from it. But it is one of those important things where, the sooner you can talk about it, get on the same page as your spouse, as your children, or, extended loved ones, anyone who will have a role or might have a role, in where you end up and how you execute that. Definitely important to, just bring it to the table and make sure that everyone is on the same page. And kind of related to that, I will say, you brought up a lot of great points about long-term care policies, funding through, hybrid life insurance. I think we see with a lot of our clients that it's not, a one and done type of deal, unfortunately. Long-term care policies, might have a place in funding your future long-term care. But as you were saying, with, the age people are living to is getting higher and higher. People are spending more on costs. The policies aren't as robust maybe as they used to be in terms of paying out all of the required benefits to really, cover your entire long-term care stay, unless you're paying, really expensive premiums when you qualify initially, like you were saying. So I do think, figuring out that sweet spot of how to self-fund with other options in there, especially to take away some of that emotional aspect, like you were saying, of feeling like you're taking away from, your legacy and what you're leaving to your family to cover this unexpected cost.
Yeah, those are great points, Heaven. I can't believe it, but we're almost at the end of the episode. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on the retirement planning challenges facing high net worth individuals. From the emotional impact of this life transition to just the uncertainties, whether those are, the future tax landscape or policy or the unknown of your future health needs. Planning for retirement can feel really overwhelming. And we've talked a little bit about, the things we see on social media, the headlines we see in the news. There's a lot of negative headlines out there about retirement preparedness in America, the state of certain programs like Social Security or Medicare. I always like to end on a positive note. Mike, what are you excited about or optimistic about today as it relates to planning for retirement?
Yeah, well, as I said before, I am an optimist at heart. And to your point before, Evan, as well, it's like these can be difficult conversations sometimes, but they're important ones. So what I'm optimistic about is a little bit contrary to what sometimes we see and hear, and even as a financial industry, we put out there. And the point is that people, when they're doing proper planning, they're not running out of money. They're able to spend. They're able to reach their goals. People are indeed retiring with dignity. Yet, I think there's behavioral element that people, no matter how much wealth they have, still sometimes have that fear. And we've even seen, households will underspend and shortchange their lifestyle because of that concern. There's also the emotional element of seeing your account balance potentially go down. If you're spending down a portion of your principal, there's just like the mental accounting and seeing that. And it's okay. There's no shame in spending some of your principal. You've earned it. So I am optimistic of the fact that people are able to retire. They're not running out of money, and they are indeed retiring with dignity. But those people are the ones that are planning, having these conversations, making it a family affair as well around all the things we're talking about, and, seeking out professional advice from folks like you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, great answer. And I have one final question, but other than JP Morgan's fantastic guide to retirement, can you recommend one book or resource maybe that can help our listeners find inspiration when it comes to retirement planning?
Oh, wow. Okay. Inspiration. Wow. So inspiration on the spot is not my expertise. So not
we changed it up.
Yeah. Okay. Not a book, but I can tell you there's a pretty cool Netflix series. It's called, I want to say it's called Live to 100 Secrets of the Blue Zones. And if you're not familiar with the Blue Zones, there are different pockets around the world where people have been identified as having outsized longevity. And there's been studies done around why is that, how is that? And the takeaway is, and they look at some pretty interesting places, some places in Europe, so Sardinia in Italy, there's some place in Greece, Costa Rica, Okinawa, there might be one or two others where there is this high incidence of people living to 100. And I won't give it all away, but what they found is it's actually related to a lot of what we've been talking about today. Is people have a purpose, they have high levels of socialization, they have a reason for getting up every day, and there's actually this element of partial retirement as well. They're still doing some level of quote unquote work. And So there seems to be some commonality. Of course, there's diet and exercise and those things, but a lot of it is around just their behaviors and what they're doing and their outlook. And pretty interesting series. So check it out. I want to say there's 4 different episodes in it. Each one's maybe about 45 minutes. So not a big commitment.
Nice. I'm going to be adding this to my list, and I'm not surprised that people in Sardinia have a high life expectancy. So thank you guys for listening. If you want to keep up with Mike, you can follow him on LinkedIn for more retirement planning insights. He's often sharing really great content. And a reminder, you can keep up with our new episodes of Off the Wall, as well as our other wealth advice for high net worth individuals by signing up for our Monument Unfiltered newsletter. You can also follow Monument Wealth on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook for our team's insights and opinions. Thank you.
Thank you.
The previous presentation by Monument Capital Management LLC was intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the presentation serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice from Monument or any other investment professional of your choosing. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that the future performance of any specific investment or investment strategy or any non-investment related planning services, discussion, or content will be profitable, be suitable for your portfolio or individual situation, or prove successful. Neither Monument's investment advisor registration status nor any amount of prior experience or success should be construed that a certain level of results or satisfaction will be achieved if Monument is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advice services. Monument is neither a law firm nor accounting firm, and no portion of its services should be construed as legal or accounting advice. No portion of the video content will be construed by a client or prospective client as a guarantee that he or she will experience a certain level of results if Monument is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. A copy of Monument's current written disclosure brochure discussing our advisory services and fees is available upon request or at www.monumentwealthmanagement.com.